Hello everyone, I'm here with my student Feng Lao. How are you?
I'm good.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
In our last lesson we learned something about the history of the English language and how it's actually several languages combined into one. So, what do you think, Feng?
It's very interesting. I have another question about it though. Why does English have two words for so many different things?
That's a good question, and I can answer it by continuing our story from our last lesson. In our previous video, we talked about the early history of the English language and how three powerful Germanic tribes, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, had come to Britain. They were collectively called the Anglo-Saxons, and their language was what we called Old English. Edward the Confessor became king in 1042. When he died on January 5th of 1066, he named Harold Godwinson as king. Harold was powerful, but he immediately faced two threats. His brother Tostig had joined forces with the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, and they attacked the north of Britain. At the same time, William, Duke of Normandy, attacked the south. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. Harold marched north and defeated the King of Norway, and then turned south to face William and his Norman army. 2 weeks later, Harold was defeated and killed, and William became King of England. This is called the Norman Conquest. And that year, 1066, became the most famous year in English history. Though the Normans spoke an early version of French, they were not exactly French. The Normans were actually the descendants of Vikings who had regularly raided the French coastline. The name comes from Norsemen, which means North men. The King of France had given them land to make peace. They were skilled in warfare and had disciplined, well-trained armies with advanced weapons such as crossbows. They also fought on horseback. The Anglo-Saxon army they defeated was a mixed group of both professional soldiers and inexperienced citizens, sometimes armed with farm implements such as pitchforks, and they relied on older methods of war such as axes and forming a shield wall. The conquering Normans felt themselves superior to the Anglo-Saxons. William left no doubt that the Saxons now must bow to him, and that the Normans were the new ruling class of England. William confiscated all the land from the Saxons and distributed it among the barons who had supported him. These barons quickly built castles to solidify their control. Any who opposed the Normans were brutally suppressed, and a new social order was imposed. Anglo-Saxon British society had been relatively egalitarian, with everyone having rights, including women. The Norman conquerors replaced this with a rigid feudal system. At the top was the king, who owned all the land. Next came the nobles, or barons. The king gave them land for money and also for providing men for the king's army. Below the nobles were the knights. The barons gave them some land in return for their loyalty and promised to fight. At the bottom were the peasant serfs. They were basically slaves with no freedom and were loaned land to raise crops, from which they had to give a percentage to those above them. The Anglo-Saxons were now the servants in their own country. This is important to understand what happened to the English language. The Normans spoke Norman French and were basically indifferent to the language of England Anglo-Saxon, Old English. They made no effort to change it or bother to learn it. The Normans did change the language of official documents from Old English to Latin. This was the custom in much of Europe. Latin also continued to be used for medical and science terminology and classification systems. The conquered people, the Anglo-Saxons, generally did not learn the language of their new overlords, Norman French. But Anglo-Saxons who worked with the Normans, such as traders who sold food items, learned French to be able to transact business. So the New England became a country of 3 languages used for different purposes by different groups. This is called triglossia. Triglossia also implies a social ranking of languages. The basic split between Anglo-Saxon Old English and Norman French was in terms of social class. The lower class spoke Old English. The ruling class spoke Norman French. The merchant class in between had to speak both. This is why there are usually 2 words for livestock. The Anglo-Saxon word used by the farmer who raised the animal, cow, pig, and the French word for the meat purchased by the upper class, beef, pork. This higher social ranking of French-derived words is what has led to the tradition that English words used in restaurants and hotels for service staff and prepared food are also French, such as concierge. Maître d'hôtel, sometimes said as simply maître d'. Sommelier, cuisine, omelette, café au lait, and many others. Shortly after 1066, the law courts began to use 3 languages. Latin was used for writing. Norman French was the primary language used in trial speech. Old English was sometimes used, but only unofficially if witnesses did not understand something. Low-level courts were conducted in Old English. This official use of Norman French in law courts has survived today in many forms. For example, the common word is lawyer, but the more formal word for basically the same thing is attorney at law, which is Norman French. Other law court words from Norman French are bailiff, defendant, plaintiff, jury, and many others. Also, in the grammar of modern English, the adjective comes in front of the noun, as in red car. But in many legal or official terms, the French grammar is used in which the adjective follows the noun, such as attorney general, court-martial, heir apparent, and many others. French is still in limited use for some very formal legal purposes in the UK, such as when the monarch gives royal assent to an act of Parliament using the phrase "La reine le veut," the Queen or the King wills it. The motto of the King or Queen of Great Britain on the shield of the Royal Coat of Arms of the United Kingdom is still in French: Dieu est mon droit, God and my right. Also on the Royal Coat of Arms is the motto of the Order of the Garter: On y soit que mal y pense. Shamed be he who thinks evil of it. This is the most prestigious honor that can be given in the UK. The Order of the Garter is related to chivalry, the code of conduct of knights, which comes from horsemanship in Old Norman French. Norman French and Anglo-Saxon Old English would coexist for hundreds of years. Gradually, the language of Middle English evolved, and many French words became part of this new version of English. Gradually, French began to fade in Great Britain. In 1399, King Henry IV took his oath in English instead of French. The down-to-earth Anglo-Saxon words and the higher-sounding French words of Norman England have continued today in thousands of everyday usages, for which there are often two words. For example, yard and garden, buy and purchase. The Germanic Old English house is any house, but the French word maison evolved into the English word mansion, which is a very large house owned by a rich person. And there are many more examples. Altogether, there are about 30 to 80,000 French or French-derived words in English. This is one reason that English has the richest and most varied vocabulary of any language in the world. C'est magnifique!
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that some words in English are actually French.
I know, I was surprised the first time I learned that too. But hey, now when we go to a nice restaurant, we can understand some of the words on the menu.
That's great.
Well, everyone, that's all for today. We'll see you in our next lesson. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.